Good evening and welcome to the Four Lakes Church of Christ meeting here in Madison, Wisconsin. We're so glad to have you with us tonight. We're here for our Wednesday evening Bible study, and tonight we're getting back to our series of lessons where we've been studying the Israelites wandering in the wilderness. And tonight we continue with Deuteronomy chapters 21 and 22. So as always, we want to invite you to be finding a Bible and turning with us to Deuteronomy chapters 21 and 22. We'll get to those in just a moment. But as always, if you have any questions, any comments about tonight's class, if you have something we need to be praying about as a church, we want to invite you to get in touch. You can reach out by sending me a message to info@fourlakeschurch.org. You can also call or send a text to 608-224-0274. We'd love to hear from you. But as I said, tonight we're back to our study of Deuteronomy, and the book of Deuteronomy is basically a record of Moses repeating the law to a new generation of Israelites before they cross over the Jordan River into the Promised Land under the leadership of Joshua, who was taking over for Moses. And a few days ago, I actually saw a reference to the Bible translated into the language of the Hawaiian people from the makers of the Jesus book. And in that translation, the book of Deuteronomy is called "The Rules the Second Time." The rules the second time. And so we are now studying a repetition of God's law to a new generation. We are looking at the rules the second time. So tonight we're going to continue with what is basically a review of certain aspects of the law of Moses. And as we read these tonight, I really hope that we keep in mind at least two things tonight. First of all, let's not try to make rules today based on what we read in Deuteronomy tonight. And I know the danger is that we see a verse and we say, well, look, it says that this is wrong, therefore it's wrong today. However, the danger is that we see that verse and we apply it in that way, and then we read a few verses later on, and it describes wearing maybe a cotton polyester blend garment as an abomination in the same sense that that was. And so we just need to remember that this is a law for a different time, a different place, a different group of people, and that we are no longer bound by the law of Moses today. So let's keep that in mind. Let's not be surprised by that. Let's not turn to Deuteronomy and say to somebody today, look, God says that's an abomination. Because they could very easily read a couple verses later on and just blow that argument out of the water. So again, this is written to a different time, different place. It's under a different covenant. This is a different covenant. All right, so that's first of all. Let's kind of keep that in the back of our minds as we study. Secondly, let's also remember that some of what we're about to read tonight does not seem fair at all by today's standards. I mean, some of it, in fact, it almost seems barbaric. With this, though, we need to realize that some of what we read tonight was God's way of regulating certain behaviors that were quite common and quite widespread back then. And I'm just thinking of the Pharisees trying to trap Jesus by having him say something unpopular on divorce in Matthew 19. And you remember they were asking why God commanded divorce in certain scenarios under the law of Moses. But if you remember that passage in Matthew 19, Jesus, though, had to correct them by explaining God merely allowed some things under the law of Moses simply due to the hardness of their hearts. And so right there, Jesus himself was admitting that the law of Moses was far from perfect. It was good for its time. But parts of the law of Moses were far less than ideal. But I think most of us would agree that God did put some rules in place to at least try to protect the powerless from some terrible abuses. And so the law certainly helped. But the law of Moses was not perfect, and we can read more about that in the book of Hebrews. So let's just keep these two things in mind. That's my advice as we study tonight. First of all, we aren't under this law. We can learn from it, but we're not under it. And then secondly, the law itself was good, but it was not perfect. It regulated some behavior that was already widespread at the time. All right, let's jump right into the text tonight. We're going to look at Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 1 through 9. This is the first paragraph, Deuteronomy 21, 1 through 9. If a slain person is found lying in the open country in the land which the Lord your God gives you to possess, and it is not known who has struck him, then your elders and your judges shall go out and measure the distance to the cities which are around the slain one. It shall be that the city which is nearest to the slain man, that is, the elders of that city, shall take a heifer of the herd, which has not been worked and which is not pulled in a yoke, And the elders of that city shall bring the heifer down to a valley with running water, which has not been plowed or sown, and shall break the heifer's neck there in the valley. Then the priests, the sons of Levi, shall come near, for the Lord your God has chosen them to serve him and to bless in the name of the Lord. And every dispute and every assault shall be settled by them. All the elders of that city which is nearest to the slain man shall wash their hands over the heifer whose neck was broken in the valley. And they shall answer and say, Our hands did not shed this blood, nor did our eyes see it. Forgive your people Israel, whom you have redeemed, O Lord, and do not place the guilt of innocent blood in the midst of your people Israel. And the blood guiltiness shall be forgiven them. So you shall remove the guilt of innocent blood from your midst when you do what is right in the sight or in the eyes of the Lord. So in the absence of DNA analysis and fingerprinting and so many things that we have available to us today, this is actually quite ingenious. And I think the scenario here is that they find somebody murdered out in the wilderness. So it's obviously not from natural causes. Something has happened. This man has been murdered, and there have been no witnesses. So nobody around, nobody's admitting it. So the question is, what do they do? As leaders, how do they handle that? Well, of course, on one hand, they could just ignore it. They could just back away slowly. Nobody saw anything. Let's just leave it right here. However, we also know under the law that there is a value to human life. And so because of that, something has to be done to indicate this person should not have died. And the fact that they were murdered is not okay. And so they're making a statement here. And so without the ability to figure out actually who did it, the elders and the judges need to go out and they need to figure out whose city is closest to the scene of the crime. So what they're doing here is establishing the jurisdiction. And we're familiar with that today. Who needs to deal with this? Where is the body? And who's responsible? And so they measure the distance from each city to the scene of the crime. And the elders from the closest city are to basically make a sacrifice. And as I see it, they are to do this as a way of publicly saying, this is not okay. So we're not sweeping this under the rug. We're not ignoring this, but we're paying attention to it. Somebody's died here. That's not all right. And so they're making this sacrifice as a public way of saying this. There's a religious aspect to this as well. Notice the Levites are called in and they are to be a part of this. There is to be a ceremony involving the Levites and the elders or the authorities of the city nearby. And they're to make a public statement that there were no witnesses. And so I think what that tells us right there is there has been already some kind of investigation. If they're going to testify that there are no witnesses, somebody has asked around. And so that seems to be a part of this that is probably implied. I think we're safe in saying that. And then notice, in the absence of witnesses, in the absence of a suspect, they are then to ask for God's forgiveness. This past Lord's Day in our study of Nehemiah, in the class that Hans taught, you may remember we noted that there are times when we may confess and ask forgiveness for sins that we personally have never committed. In Nehemiah, for example, they were confessing the sins of their ancestors. They weren't responsible for that, and yet they were there. And there was a value to confessing the sins of those in the past. And so here they're asking for God's forgiveness as a community. Even though they don't know who did this, they are acknowledging that something terrible has happened. And they're asking for God to forgive them as a group. They're asking that God will not hold this against them as a people. Remember, the alternative here is that they cover it up or that they ignore it. And certainly that would have made it even worse. And so I think they're acknowledging here that somebody has sinned. Somebody was responsible for this. And so they're bringing the Lord in here with the sacrifice, and they're asking for his forgiveness upon them as a group. All right, let's move on tonight with Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 10 through 17. Kind of two little paragraphs here, Deuteronomy 21, 10 through 17. When you go out to do battle against your enemies, and the Lord your God delivers them into your hands, and you take them away captive, and see among the captives a beautiful woman, and have a desire for her, and would take her as a wife for yourself, then you shall bring her home to your house, and she shall shave her head and trim her nails. She shall also remove the clothes of her captivity, and shall remain in your house, and mourn her father and mother a full month. And after that you may go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. It shall be, if you are not pleased with her, then you shall let her go wherever she wishes. But you shall certainly not sell her for money. You shall not mistreat her, because you have humbled her. If a man has two wives, the one loved and the other unloved, and both the loved and the unloved have borne him sons, if the firstborn son belongs to the unloved, then it shall be in the day he wills what he has to his sons, he cannot make the son of the loved the firstborn before the son of the unloved, who is the firstborn. But he shall acknowledge the firstborn, the son of the unloved, by giving him a double portion of all that he has. For he is the beginning of his strength. To him belongs the right of the firstborn. In the first part here, notice God regulates what happens when the Israelites conquer an enemy and when they take their women as wives. So I want us to notice, obviously this is terrible from our point of view. It's like we can hardly believe this is actually in the Bible. But I want us to think about the alternative as we move through this. Notice how God structures this. There is to be a process to it. So this isn't just a matter of running in, grabbing somebody, and this one's mine, and I'm dragging her home. That's not it. But there's a process to it where she transitions from her old culture to Israelite culture. She's given this 30 days to mourn for her family. And the restriction on the tail end of it here is that if the Israelite man ends up not liking this woman, he is to let her go, but he's not able to sell her or mistreat her in the process. And so I think it's interesting. We have a terrible thing, but it's at least somewhat regulated for the sake of those who were conquered. And again, think of how these things were done at that time and place elsewhere in the ancient world. This certainly brings some structure and at least some protection for the woman into this scenario. Well, in the second scenario here, we have a man who has two wives. So one he loves and one he does not. And that's messed up right there. We see that a few times in the Bible. But first of all, having multiple wives was never God's intention. I think we need to admit that here at the beginning. So from the beginning of time, from the Garden of Eden, God intended for one man and one woman to be together, to be married for life. However, if a man chooses to have multiple wives, notice God now puts some rules in place for the sake of the women and here the children in this scenario. By law, the man is not allowed to give his inheritance to the son of the woman he loves. But instead, he has to give the bulk of the inheritance to the son of the firstborn, regardless of whether he is the son of the wife he doesn't love. All right, so again, not perfect by any means, but God was regulating certain behavior to try to protect those who were especially vulnerable. Okay, let's continue with Deuteronomy 21, verses 18 through 23. Deuteronomy 21, verses 18 through 23. If any man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey his father or his mother, and when they chastise him, he will not even listen to them, then his father and mother shall seize him and bring him out to the elders of his city at the gateway of his hometown. They shall say to the elders of his city, "This son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He is a glutton and a drunkard." Then all the men of his city shall stone him to death. You shall remove the evil from your midst, and all Israel will hear of it and fear. If a man has committed a sin worthy of death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his corpse shall not hang all night on the tree, but you shall surely bury him on the same day. For he who is hanged is accursed of God, so that you do not defile your land which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance. Well, two things here, starting with a rebellious son up in that first paragraph. And I know when I was a kid, I remember thinking this rebellious son was a kid like me, maybe 10 years old or something, and I think I've adjusted my thinking on this through the years. What evidence do we have here that might suggest that this rebellious son is not a child? Well, we look over this paragraph and we find that he is, in fact, a glutton and a drunkard. And so this rebellious son, therefore, is almost certainly older than what I might have imagined when I was younger. So as I look at this, this is not a case of a 10-year-old refusing to go to bed on time or refusing to clean his or her room. That's not what's happening. But instead, here we're talking about somebody who is living a wild and rebellious life. At the same time, though, let's also realize that this rebellious son is not obeying his parents. And so we combine all of what we've thought about up to this point, and it seems that he's not quite out on his own yet either. So he's somewhere in between. So as I see this, perhaps then we are dealing with somebody who's no longer a child, but he's still somewhat within his parents' sphere of influence. So either in the wilderness wanderings, if you remember, God set the age of accountability at 20. And so I'm kind of thinking somewhere around the age of 20, like definitely old enough to know better. He's old enough to be a glutton and a drunkard. But he's not so young that he really doesn't get it, where the death penalty should be an option. And he's not old enough that he's out of the house and no longer mom and dad's responsibility. So somewhere maybe in the early 20s. And so as a result, the punishment is more than a timeout, as we might say today. So there is some serious rebellion going on here, and his parents have already chastised him. And the purpose of executing the death penalty here is so that the rest of the nation will also be fearful of sinning in a similar way. In the second paragraph here, we have some clarification on the death penalty, not just this guy, but also from some of the other passages where the death penalty would be executed. If someone has done something worthy of death and is hanged on a tree, that person has to be buried the same day. In other words, they were not to leave that body up on the tree permanently, but that body is to be treated with respect. And before we move on from this, I want to ask, where does this become relevant in the New Testament? Well, Jesus was also hanged on a tree in a sense, wasn't he? And that's why it was so important that his body be taken down and buried before sunset on the day he was murdered, which is interesting because we have these people breaking the law by murdering the Son of God without a fair trial, but they're still concerned that the body get buried before nightfall. So very consistent. We're going to follow this rule over here, but not so many of the others. Well, the last two verses are especially significant to us today, though, because Jesus was hanged on a tree. And anyone who is hanged on a tree is accursed of God. And Jesus went through this for us. So this passage is quoted by Paul in Galatians 3:13, where he ties it to Jesus doing this so that we might be able to receive the blessing of Abraham. So Jesus takes our place on the cross. We receive the promise through faith. And Jesus redeems us from the curse of the law of Moses by becoming a curse for us, by hanging on a tree. And that goes back to these verses here in the book of Deuteronomy. All right, let's jump over into the next chapter, and we'll look at one more chapter tonight. The first paragraph here is Deuteronomy 22, verses 1 through 4. Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 1 through 4. You shall not see your countryman's ox or his sheep straying away and pay no attention to them. You shall certainly bring them back to your countrymen. If your countryman is not near you, or if you do not know him, then you shall bring it home to your house, and it shall remain with you until your countryman looks for it. Then you shall restore it to him. Thus you shall do with his donkey, and you shall do the same with his garment, and you shall do likewise with anything lost by your countryman which he has lost, and you have found. You are not allowed to neglect them. You shall not see your countryman's donkey or his ox fallen down on the way and pay no attention to them. You shall surely help him to raise them up. Well, how interesting that God makes this a part of his law. So if you see your neighbor's ox or sheep wandering around somewhere, you're not allowed to ignore it. You can't just back away from that and say, not my problem, because now it is your problem. It's in the law. And so you are to bring it back to your neighbor. And if your neighbor's too far, you have to bring his animal home, take care of it yourself until your neighbor goes looking for it, and you make that connection. So the same thing goes for his donkey or his coat or anything else that belongs to your neighbor. You can't just keep it. Oh, look, a donkey. Now it's mine. Good for me. But you have to actually take steps to get this thing back to your neighbor, whether it's an animal or a piece of clothing or whatever it is. And this may seem rather minor, but that donkey may not be minor to your neighbor. In a sense, this is almost like the golden rule, isn't it? But it's legislated very specifically. Of course, if I lose my favorite coat, I'd like to think that somebody would try to get it back to me. So therefore, I should probably do the same for others. If I find a coat, I need to take steps to bring it back and make that connection. Years ago, we were driving on Highway PD down on the southwest side of Madison, and I looked out the window and there was an iPad sitting on top of the car driving next to us. And it's been so long, I don't remember all the details. I do remember waving wildly, trying to get them to stop. And, that makes no sense to the one who's getting waved at. It's probably annoying, and I might be scared to stop if some big bearded guy next to me is yelling and waving at me also. But think about that. If the situation had been reversed, if it were my laptop or my phone sitting on top of my car, I would like to think that somebody would try to let me know what was happening. And as I remember it, they eventually pulled over and they rescued that tablet from the roof of their car. But I'm just saying that's an illustration of what God is trying to communicate here. And again, we aren't bound by this today. I can't say, based on Deuteronomy 22, 1 through 4, this is the case. But we do have a higher law. According to Jesus in Matthew 7:12, in everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you. For this is the law and the prophets. And I just want us to notice how Jesus says, for this is the law and the prophets. This isn't explicitly found in the law and the prophets, but the concept is there. And we see that concept introduced to us here in Deuteronomy chapter 22. All right, let's continue with Deuteronomy 22, verses 5 through 12. Deuteronomy 22, 5 through 12. A woman shall not wear man's clothing, nor shall a man put on woman's clothing, for whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God. If you happen to come upon a bird's nest along the way, in any tree or on the ground with young ones or eggs, and the mother sitting on the young or on the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. You shall certainly let the mother go, but the young you may take for yourself, in order that it may be well with you, and that you may prolong your days. When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof, so that you will not bring blood guilt on your house if anyone falls from it. You shall not sow your vineyard with two kinds of seed, or all the produce of the seed which you have sown, and the increase of the vineyard will become defiled. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. You shall not wear a material mixed of wool and linen together. You shall make yourself tassels on the four corners of your garment with which you cover yourself. Okay, there is all kinds of stuff here, and it seems like a lot of it's not related, so we just kind of threw all these in together. And this is one of those passages where I was referring to earlier that we just need to be careful to apply it properly, understanding we're no longer under this law. In verse 5, for example, some have jumped on this as God's law for us today on the transgender question. And so they'll say, Deuteronomy 22, verse 5, a man shall not wear a woman's clothing and vice versa. Therefore, this is a sin. And, I think there's something we can learn from this passage, but let's also realize that if we keep reading, we get down to verse 11, where it's also a sin to wear anything with a wool and linen blend. And maybe you've heard this passage applied to pantsuits. I remember that controversy when I was little, I think back in the 70s and 80s. And some churches, I think, used this to make rules that women had to wear dresses to church. No pants for you. The Bible says it's a sin. That's man's clothing. It's an abomination for a woman to dress like a man. Therefore, this is true. And yet, I don't remember anybody making the same arguments about mixing wool and linen in your clothing. I don't remember anybody talking about that being an abomination to the Lord and, checking labels and percentages on the way into church. So let's just be careful how we apply this. We do see some instruction concerning how men and women are different or are to appear to be different. It's to be external and it's to be obvious under the new law. And that's all we need. So I'm just saying, let's focus on the new covenant, since that's the covenant that we are under. So let's just not depend on this passage right here ripped out of context. And I would just take it as a reminder that the transgender issue has been an issue going back many, many years, dating back to at least 1400 BC. When this was first written. And in this passage, God was reminding his people that women were to dress like women, the men were to dress like men, and what that actually looked like would certainly depend on the culture at the time. They didn't even have pants back then. So, there's another reason not to apply this today and get all uptight about this being a law for us. This is not about us. This verse is definitely not about pantsuits. All right. Then we got a series of random rules in verses 6 and 7. Don't take mother bird away from the nest. It's just wrong. You can take the young, not the mom. In verse 8, this one sounds like OSHA. If you build a new house, put a parapet, a railing around the roof so people don't fall off. As I remember it, one of our members had a project early on replacing, I think it was the copper cladding along the parapet at UW Hospital. As I remember hearing about that, that project took a long time making his way all the way around there. And whenever I visit somebody at UW Hospital, I always look around at that copper cladding out there, and I think to myself, I know who did that. And it's just interesting. A parapet. I don't know if I've really used that word up until I learned about that at UW Hospital a few years ago. It's just not a word that we use today. But a parapet is that kind of, I would call it a railing or some kind of short wall so that somebody doesn't fall off a tall roof. So UW Hospital doesn't just go straight down. There's something up there to kind of keep people from just accidentally walking off. In verse 9, don't mix seed in your vineyard, like maintain the purity of the crop. And again, do we apply that today? I mix all kinds of seed in my garden. I get my seeds from jungs, and I go out and I plant squash and carrots and green beans and onions and all kinds of stuff through the years in the same piece of ground. But this was important for them at that time. In verse 10, don't plow with an ox and donkey yoked together. And if you think about that, that would be unfair to both animals, wouldn't it? I mean, it would be frustrating at the least. It would be dangerous at the worst, not only for the animals, also for the farmer. And we don't think today about plowing with oxen and donkeys. So I'm kind of thinking, try going on a walk with a Great Dane and a Chihuahua. If you were to tie those two dogs together at the neck, one of them's getting dragged. And I think that's what the Lord is saying here. Don't do that. Don't harness or yoke two animals together that are not the same size. And Paul, by the way, will go on to apply this in one of his Corinthian letters. Don't be unequally yoked with an unbeliever. He's talking to Christians there. Basically, don't allow yourself to get dragged along by the neck like that in a relationship. Don't let yourself get pulled away by the Lord, by any other human. In verse 11, we've got the warning about mixing wool and linen. And I'm not sure exactly why. Maybe the garment would shrink unevenly and kind of ruin both fibers. Maybe this was tied to some pagan ritual. We're not really sure. In honor of this verse, I'm wearing a wool blend shirt tonight. Okay, I think this is like 54% wool, 46% polyester of some kind. But I know my sister has told me about hiking and her work out there in the Pacific Northwest. Wool is good. Cotton kills. Wool, God designed sheep so they don't freeze to death when it rains. And wool insulates even when it's wet. And so that's a good garment for hiking. So through the years, I've kept an eye out for wool garments. And this is one of the first I found. I think it was an outdoor outfitter out in the Pacific Northwest. And this one was on the clearance rack. I think it's Smart Wool. And it has held up for many years and taken me on lots of adventures. So right here, what I'm wearing tonight would have been an abomination to God under the old law. But thankfully, we are no longer under that law. All right, in verse 12, they were told to put tassels on their garments. And this goes back to Numbers 15, where they were first told about that. The tassels were to remind them to follow the Lord's commandments. So I would compare the tassels almost to the proverbial tying a string on your finger. I've never tied a string on my finger to remember something. We don't do that today. Most of us don't. I've never seen it. But we do set alarms on our phones, don't we? So this is kind of the equivalent of that. We write notes on Post-it notes or whatever to remember stuff. So this was the ancient equivalent of that. By the time we get to Jesus, though, remember the people had abused this command, haven't they? They were lengthening their tassels to prove how righteous they were. Can we picture that? They had the phylacteries, the boxes with scripture, and they were making theirs extra huge. Because I'm so spiritual, I need a huge box on my forehead to hold the Word of God in that I'm studying today. And my tassel is 2 feet long. Yours is just short. I'm more spiritual than you are. That was the attitude. And Jesus really came down on that in Matthew chapter 23, verse 5, if you want to look into that a little bit more. All right, let's continue with Deuteronomy 22, 13 through 22. Deuteronomy 22, 13 through 22. If any man takes a wife and goes into her and then turns against her and charges her with shameful deeds and publicly defames her, and says, I took this woman, but when I came near her, I did not find her a virgin, Then the girl's father and her mother shall take and bring out the evidence of the girl's virginity to the elders of the city at the gate. The girl's father shall say to the elders, I gave my daughter to this man for a wife, but he turned against her. And behold, he has charged her with shameful deeds, saying, I did not find your daughter a virgin. But this is the evidence of my daughter's virginity. And they shall spread the garment before the elders of the city. So the elders of that city shall take the man and chastise him, and they shall fine him 100 shekels of silver, and give it to the girl's father, because he publicly defamed a virgin of Israel. And she shall remain his wife. He cannot divorce her all of his days. But if this charge is true, that the girl was not found a virgin, then they shall bring out the girl to the doorway of her father's house, and the men of her city shall stone her to death, because she has committed an act of folly in Israel by playing the harlot in her father's house. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you. If a man is found lying with a married woman, then both of them shall die, the man who lay with the woman and the woman. Thus you shall purge the evil from Israel. Well, this seems so foreign, I think, to most of us, but apparently back in those days, the parents would keep the evidence of their daughter's virginity from her wedding night for this reason. So if a man takes a virgin daughter and then later accuses her of not having been a virgin on the wedding night, the parents would then bring this evidence, this garment that they had saved, to the elders of the city. And in that case, the man would be reprimanded by the elders. He would pay a fine that would then be given to the woman's family for defaming their daughter. And that would be, I think, preventative in the future. I think that would keep other people from making a false accusation like that. But if, though, the accusation is true, then the young woman is to be stoned to death. And that was God's way of keeping his people pure. This is important to God. Then in verse 22, we've got this brief statement about a man lying with a married woman. So this is the sin of adultery. And notice, both the man and the woman are to be put to death. And this reminds us, I think, of the woman caught in the very act of adultery in John chapter 8. If you remember, the leaders only bring Jesus the woman. But where's the man? You know, we aren't told what Jesus wrote in the dirt on that occasion, but some have suggested that Jesus wrote this verse. And the text tells us that the accusers in John chapter 8 started leaving from the oldest to the youngest. And I think that's significant. In my opinion, the old guys could see where this was going. Jesus was basically asking, if you caught this woman in the very act of adultery, then where is the man? Because the law says that both the man and the woman are to be stoned to death. And so I think the assumption on my part is this was a setup, and that the man was working for the Jewish leaders. That's just speculation on my part. We don't really know what Jesus wrote in the dirt. That's a great mystery. Hopefully we'll figure it out in the other side of eternity. But I'm just saying that this passage here might be a possibility in that Jesus was calling them out for their hypocrisy. If there will be any stoning today, go get the man, and we're going to stone them together. I think that might have been what Jesus was getting at. I'm not swearing my soul on that. I'm saying that is one of the leading possibilities here, that this reference from Deuteronomy might have been involved in some way. All right, let's conclude tonight with Deuteronomy 22, verses 23 through 30. Deuteronomy 22, 23 through 30. If there is a girl who is a virgin engaged to a man, and another man finds her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out to the gate of that city, and you shall stone them to death, the girl because she did not cry out in the city, and the man because he has violated his neighbor's wife. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you. But if in the field the man finds the girl who is engaged, and the man forces her and lies with her, then only the man who lies with her shall die. But you shall do nothing to the girl. There is no sin in the girl worthy of death. For just as a man rises against his neighbor and murders him, so is this case. When he found her in the field, the engaged girl cried out, but there was no one to save her. If a man finds a girl who is a virgin who is not engaged and seizes her and lies with her, and they are discovered, then the man who lay with her shall give to the girl's father 50 shekels of silver, and she shall become his wife because he has violated her. He cannot divorce her all his days. A man shall not take his father's wife so that he will not uncover his father's skirt. Well, once again, this is far from ideal. That's, I think, to say the least, based on today's standards. It is an interesting solution considering what was going on back then. First of all, in verses 23 and 24, if a man lies with a woman in the city, and if she does not cry out for help, both the man and the woman are to be put to death. On the other hand, if this happens to an engaged woman in the wilderness or out in the middle of nowhere in a field somewhere, then only the man is to be put to death because it might have been an attack. It might not have been a consensual relationship. And then finally, if a man has relations with a woman who's a virgin and not engaged and they're discovered, the man is to pay the girl's father basically a dowry. And they are to get married, and that marriage is to be for life. And again, that doesn't sound fair to us at all. And it probably makes most of us mad just thinking about that. But in those times and without witnesses, that is about all they could do to protect the young woman. I mean, without this, she'd pretty much be unable to ever get married. And then she'd end up living in poverty for the rest of her life, or worse, forced into a life of prostitution or whatever. All right, then in verse 30, we've got this little bonus clause forbidding a man from getting married to his father's wife. So I would take that not necessarily his mother's, not what's going on there, but his stepmother, the way it's worded, his father's wife, as I understand that. And we think that's messed up, and obviously it is. But it's interesting, we have this exact scenario in 1 Corinthians 5 under the New Covenant, don't we? And if you remember, the church was pretty much bragging about how tolerant and loving they were being by accepting this man in this new relationship. So Paul was condemning them. You should be mourning over this, but instead you're proud of it. You're bragging about it. And that's where we find that this is also wrong under the new law. And under the new law, Paul tells the church to kick the guy out. I'm just paraphrasing there, but you got to remove that kind of sin from the church. We can't accept that. We can't accept people living in sexual sin like that. And the reason for kicking the guy out is, first of all, he might have a chance at being saved if he sees how serious that is. And then also so that the sin wouldn't spread within the congregation. Like, I don't want to do that because that might happen to me. And then also, I think, to protect the reputation of the church in the community. They had to have standards. We also have to have standards in the Lord's church today. And so for that reason, we are to remove somebody who's engaged in ongoing continual sin. We're to remove them from the congregation. Well, this brings us to a place where we can pause for a week. So next week, we hope to continue with chapters 23 and 24. And again, we're moving pretty quickly. We've been covering 2 chapters a week. We're not covering 4 or 5 chapters a week like we did through some of Leviticus, but we're booking it. Deuteronomy is an important book. We don't want to be stuck in it forever, though, for a couple years. So we're booking it through the book of Deuteronomy. As always, thank you for being with us tonight. If we can be praying for you concerning some situation in your life, if we can help or encourage you spiritually, again, we want to invite you to reach out. You can send an email to me, info@fourlakeschurch.org. You can also give me a call or send a text to 608-224-0274. As we close tonight, let's go to God in prayer. Our Father in heaven, tonight we praise you for being a Father who loves us. And you're a Father who wants what's best for us, even when we don't understand. Father, especially when we don't understand, you still love us. We're thankful for the law that you gave to your people through your servant Moses. It was truly amazing for its time. And tonight, of course, we're thankful for your new law, the covenant that you made with us through Jesus, your Son. We're thankful for the sacrifice that made it possible. Thank you, Father, for Jesus. We come to you tonight in his name. Amen.